Hi, my name's Grace Oedel, and I am here today with Mariah Gladstone, who is one of our featured presenters at the 38th Annual NOFA Vermont Winter Conference. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, it's really great to be here.
Could you share a little bit about the work that you do in the world and how you've come to do it?
Yeah, my main center of work is through a business that I started called Indigikitchen, which is a combination of Indigenous digital and kitchen. And it's about showcasing Indigenous foods through a YouTube channel and highlighting recipes and teaching people about making foods using traditional Indigenous ingredients.
That's really amazing. How long have you been doing that work for?
Since late 2016.
Okay. And can you speak about your decision to sort of use social media, and how does sharing information work in that way? And how are you hoping to sort of bring people into this learning?
I think anytime we want to share information in the 21st century, you need to have an online presence, and Indigenous foods are not an exception to that. We want our recipes and our traditional food information to be Googleable. Mm-hmm. And so I went the way that many food bloggers have gone and decided to approach things using digital media and utilizing videos, not only because they are eye-catching and help share information, but also because they make information accessible to people that didn't grow up reading cookbooks and don't know the variety of French words that are used in standard cooking recipes. And I think it's important that people recognize cooking as approachable and accomplishable for anyone to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Do you feel like there's a robust community online of other folks working to reintroduce and help folks remember or learn for the first time Indigenous foodways? Is there a wide movement out there?
Yeah, it ranges from Facebook groups that are sharing recipes to foragers and people that are interested in getting into foraging that are using Instagram to share pictures of plants and ask people to help identify them, or asking Twitter for why their amaranth didn't pop, which is actually a tweet I got about 2 minutes before I walked in here, was, all my amaranth burnt. How do I fix this? At Mariah Gladstone. And so there is this huge online community, like there is in any ethnic or national space, but it's people that are excited about traditional foods, but that for one reason or another didn't grow up learning that, and they realize that they have access to that information through this digital moccasin telegraph of connection.
Cool. Thank you. You shared this morning that you have lineages in both the Cherokee and the Blackfoot traditions. Is that right?
Yeah, my mom's Cherokee, dad's Blackfeet.
Nice. And can you speak about how do those food traditions differ, and what do you take from each sort of from each parent?
Yeah, my mom's nation was, of course, forcibly relocated to Oklahoma from the southeastern modern-day United States, and they took with them on that journey their farming and agricultural traditions. Of course, plants like the Three Sisters, they took with them seeds that made that journey as well. And now Cherokee Nation has a seed bank where you can log in online using your enrollment number and get seeds dispersed to you through a Cherokee seed bank. And those are descendants of plants that were taken along the Trail of Tears. And I think about this regenerative and sustainable agriculture that has existed for thousands of years, and the seeds that I'll be planting in my garden that have descended from those plants, and the cultivation and breeding that was done by my ancestors. But I look at my dad's family, my Blackfeet ancestors, and see this movement of, following and finding food and cultivating food in a sense where it grew the best naturally. And so, what we think of as farming in the United States tends to be very linear. I mean that quite literally in terms of the ways that we plant in rows. And in reality, the cultivation of food does not always look like that. And sometimes it is taking care of a specific plot where food grows and making sure that it is able to keep growing there even without constant maintenance or attendance. And I think that's more what my Blackfeet ancestors recognized, that ability to plant the food where it will be watered and where it will grow even as we're on the road hunting buffalo. So I think about that as well, and just this nurturing of our ecosystems to feed us.
Yeah, thank you. You spoke really poignantly this morning around the sort of tradition around hunting the bison in the Blackfeet Nation, and how that those genocide was very twinned there, that the eradication of a staple food was in very deep connection with a genocidal project also. So that something about, a people being so deeply connected to one food source that those stories are intimately bound up.
Yeah, it is haunting to read the reports of the U.S. government from the mid-1850s and the setup and framing and justification of nearly wiping a species off the planet, very intentionally to damage and exert control over Native peoples. It was the 1850 Commissioner of Indian Affairs report that wrote, "It is cheaper in the end to feed the whole flock for a year than to fight them for a week," referring, of course, to Native people. The idea was by eliminating a major source of food for Native people and making them dependent on government rations, the U.S. government would essentially eliminate any resistance to their expansion. And so bison populations crashed from 60 million to less than 1,000 at one point. And of course, along with that, Native people did become almost 100% dependent on government rations. And along with that, our political sovereignty crashed and the health of our communities crashed. And it was through that and looking at these outcomes that Native people are facing today that I came to this work trying to revitalize Indigenous food systems and work on restoring Indigenous food sovereignty, and really launched the whole idea of Indigikitchen.
Thank you for that. You spoke this morning about really coming to understand this idea of a food desert as, one where people did not have access to the control of their own food sources and the foods that they wanted to eat, the foods that they felt connected to, and that you shared this idea of what if people could go outside and pick a salad and know how to do that. Can you share more about what that, process has been like to imagine what that would be like, and how do you go about? You said these are not new technologies; they're new with a K. They're old technologies and ways of knowing that we had, but that we have been severed very intentionally in this case through forcible movement and straight up genocide. So, how do you go about that work? That when there has been such an intense break that's been forced.
Yeah, I think it's, re-examining how we see our spaces in food deserts, and not as an indicator of things that we do not have access to, but places that we need to learn more about and understand. I think even the term food desert, well, it's and USDA definition that's used to map certain areas is inherently problematic, as even desert spaces are not empty or barren or absent plenty of resources for those that understand how to see them and understand how they work. And so this idea of food deserts only determines our distance from stores where we can use money to buy food, and doesn't necessarily tell us how far we are from food. And for my family, we're 40 miles from the nearest grocery store. I guess 30 miles if we drive into Canada, but it's we're still able to grow plenty of fresh foods, and we have access to wild game. And those are areas of richness that people living in urban areas don't necessarily have access to. And in that sense, we're living in a much richer ecosystem than other folks in urban areas where you need money to eat. And I think there's excitement about this idea of recognizing how to feed ourselves, but also recognizing this ancestral wisdom and the inherent value of our identities as Indigenous people. And I think that's also part of this healing process that we're finding. Food sovereignty is connected to our health, it's connected to our identities, but it's also connected to our political sovereignty. And the idea of making sure that we depended on government food systems was so we would not be able to push back against colonial expansion. If we regain control of our food systems, if we as sovereign nations are able to feed ourselves, then we have the ability to push back and assert our sovereignty.
Thank you for that. You spoke when we talked on the phone about some of the sort of political sovereignty work, particularly as it pertains to borders, and borders being really a fake idea that's just been imposed on the land and on connections that were previously open and flowing, as folks traveled across the landscape. And you shared one project that's being explored around, I believe, a bison processing plant. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that project at all?
Yeah, there are, of course, treaties that have been signed in the past by between the U.S. and it was the Crown, the British government, the Jay Treaty, essentially allowing Native people to pass across the medicine line, the 49th parallel, the Canadian border, freely. And so, without the abolition of that treaty, we assume that it exists to this day. And while Canada's recognition of the Jay Treaty is often in flux, they do allow Native people to enter Canada with our tribal IDs, as well as into the United States. So without a passport, I can drive into Canada, and Canadian First Nations people can use their status cards to drive into the US. And so the Blackfeet tribe back home is looking at that and also seeing that there are other opportunities within that lie within agriculture and our ability to create functions of trade and transport across the new border that has been established, but with the larger Blackfoot Confederacy that exists within present-day Alberta. And so we're looking at the feasibility of building a processing facility for bison, where we can take bison not only raised in the Blackfeet Nation in present-day Montana, but also north of the border, and bison that they have, and consolidating the collective raising of bison and our ability to sell that and to process it safely under one roof, and as a confederacy of states. And so we're looking at that. And, we started all of this by signing a new treaty. Treaties are still being signed into the 21st century. And we signed a Bison Treaty, and it started between the Blackfeet Nation and the 3 other nations that are part of the Blackfoot Confederacy up north. And other tribes have signed on to that to allow the free passage of bison, as they should be, as wild animals. But also, it's interesting to see both Canada and the US recognizing that as sovereign nations, Native people are now making treaties without them, and then trying to get in on that, and how can we be part of this, and either sign on and hopefully recognize the rights of animals to pass borders, but also do so in a way that is not exerting a colonial paternalism that is often present in these treaty relationships.
That is so fascinating and exciting to hear about.
Yeah, it'd be cool to see the results of the feasibility study on it.
Yes, absolutely. You introduced yourself this morning as part of the panel that you were featured on, using your native language. And could you speak about that choice and sort of language preservation in the context of your food sovereignty and political sovereignty work, and how there's a connection there?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I try to identify myself, introduce myself in Blackfeet because that's the language that I got my quote unquote Indian name in. And so I introduced myself in Blackfeet as a recognition that we are very much still here. That includes my voicemail also being in Blackfeet before it's in English. And that's in addition to a recognition that we're still here, is part of me just getting telemarketers to hang up first.
Good tactic.
Yeah. But it's a call to the languages that have existed on this continental space for thousands of years. And also, as I think it relates to the Blackfeet language, is as an Algonquin language in the linguistic family, it is a recognition of a way of being that is very much centered on action. Our language is unlike English in that it is very much verb-based. And so you don't have a chair, you have a thing that you sit upon. And, the words are all focused on movement and doing. And I think for many people who tend to think of themselves in nouns, I'm always trying to shift that, even as I think in English, to thinking of my identity more in verbs and what I do. I'm not a dancer, but I dance, right? And I don't consider myself a chef, but I cook. And I think part of that is this recognition that I'm only as good or as I can represent myself through my actions. And I think it's important for the plants and the animals and the land to hear Indigenous languages spoken. I think it's fascinating that my friends in college get foreign language credits for taking Indigenous languages, which is really ironic, considering English is the foreign language. But I think it's part of a recognition, especially in groups of non-natives or non-Blackfeet people that aren't necessarily going to understand what I'm saying. But I think it's important that the land hears languages.
That's beautiful. It makes me think about, the focus of the language on verbs. think about also your noticing around the richness of the landscape, and that, part of interacting with that is knowing what these plants can do, what this land can do, what it offers, how it moves, and that there's something very colonialist about we are one noun, we are one identity. A lot of that is wrapped up in money, how we make money, how we buy and sell food, this is just feels like a reductive, a simplistic identity to commit to. Like this plant is one thing, rather than this plant could be this kind of food or this kind of food for an animal or whatnot. So it feels very connected to your earlier point.
Yeah, I think I speak about relationships a lot. I speak about connection a lot. And for many people, they'll be like, oh yes, we need to get a better understanding of how we can use these things and how we can recognize, all of these resources that are out there. And even coming from a sustainability perspective, I also want to just point out that I think it's okay to see relationships even when you're not part of them, or even if those things don't have a connection to humans or are not a resource for humans. There are other beings that may depend on them, or there are little connections that exist all over. And I think that's part of the unfortunate structure that certain, whether it's folks working in agriculture or whether it's conservation ecologists, and whether it's people working in these systems, it's often still centered through this anthropocentric lens. And I think it's perfectly okay to just see things for their connection and their space in the universe. I think all of that together as this complicated system is this oneness, but not in a sense of uniformity, but in the sense of mutual ties and invisible threads that are connecting, but separate us in our diversity. And I think of this Blackfeet word, which has been translated to mean like God, or this, I don't know, it's been translated almost as a religious thing, but it's Spayatbiopa, and it means essentially the one through whom we live, but it's much more about this connecting, unifying energy that all beings have. And that as a recognition of place and inherent value, but the value in our connections.
Thank you so much. I want to end on that. I guess I'll just ask finally, is there any good way to learn more about your work or to learn from those you're learning from? Are there people you would suggest that our listeners read or follow or get involved?
Yeah, you can find me online at indigikitchen.com, which is INDIGI kitchen. I think there's also lots of other interesting folks doing work with native foods. Sean Sherman, of course, known as the Sioux tribe chef, and Brian Yazzie the chef. There's a lot of native cooks that have their own cooking spaces, whether that's restaurants or whether that's digital spaces. And I think starting to get connected with those folks, or looking up indigenous foods, or recognizing the ancestral foods or the local foods that have grown in your area, is a really cool way of starting to think about some of that knowledge.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.